Rebels were a creature type originally introduced in Mercadian Masques. Most of that set's rebels were capable of recruiting other rebels. That is, you could pay a mana cost and they would let you tutor up a rebel from your deck and put it directly into play. This is pretty powerful, as it gives you a way to get card advantage, and since most rebels had this ability, you could just keep using those abilities to quickly populate the board. This mechanic proved so good that rebels managed to break an entire format and were pretty dominant in another one. Since Masques Block, rebels have returned from time to time, most recently in Phyrexia All Will Be One, where rebel tokens were used for the 4 Mirrodin mechanic. In all, there are 74 rebels in Magic, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Skyshroud Poacher. While most Masques Block rebels can only search up other rebels, Skyshroud Poacher does something a little bit different. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's a 2/2, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to search up an elf permanent card and put it on the battlefield. So, not only does it search up a different creature type, elves, it also doesn't care what the mana value of the card is. Obviously enough, there are some pretty powerful elves in Magic, and being able to grab one from your deck for 3 mana can be pretty awesome. It first found success in Standard, where it was played in decks that weren't that elf-centric, but the format did have 2 pretty powerful elves, Rofellos and Deranged Hermit. Grabbing Rofellos usually gave you a huge mana boost when you untapped, and grabbing Deranged Hermit gave you a ton of bodies for a very cheap cost. If you did it at the end of your opponent's turn, you were also more likely to be able to pay the echo cost on your upkeep. It also saw some more sporadic play in Extended and Legacy, formats where it did see play in decks that were all about the elf creature type. In those decks it was used for grabbing powerful elf lords like Elvish Champion, but the Poacher was also really great at searching up toolbox creatures like Viridian Zealot or Caller of the Claw, which were good in just the right situation. Skyshroud Poacher hasn't seen play anywhere since 2007, but right now there also aren't any rebel cards that aren't on this list that are seeing significant play anywhere, so it may have a spot on this list for the foreseeable future. At number 9, it's Lightbringer. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 2/2, and you can tap it and sacrifice it to exile a black creature from the game. While Lightbringer isn't always useful, having a creature that can double as a removal spell, exile removal even, is a nice thing to have. And remember, many rebels have the ability to tutor up other rebels, so even just having one of these in your deck was plenty, because you could grab it when it was at its most useful. Rebel decks were utterly dominant in Masques Block Constructed, and also fairly successful in Standard. A singleton copy of Lightbringer in the main deck was pretty common. It was probably at its most useful in Standard, where control decks often tried to win using Nether Spirit, a creature that normally refuses to stay dead, but if Lightbringer exiled it, you didn't have to worry about it ever again. Lightbringer hasn't gained any points though since rotating out of Standard. At number 8, it's Joval Queen. For 4 generic and 2 white, she's a 4/7 with Vigilance, and that's it. This is a card that probably wouldn't even be that successful in Limited today, but between 2000 and 2001 it achieved 6 Pro Tour top 8s and 3 Regional or Grand Prix top 8s in Block and Standard. This is partly because Masques Block was famously underpowered, a block that didn't have very many big creatures in general. Joval was massive for the block, and especially massive for a rebel, and in mirror matches between rebel decks, she was especially good. Most of them are 3/3 or smaller, so taking her down in combat is pretty challenging, and there wasn't even that much removal that could handle 7 toughness. Then you throw in the fact that you could recruit her onto the battlefield at some point, and you end up with a card that was actually pretty good in its original context. However, it of course hasn't gained any points since 2001. At number 7, it's Rebel Informer. For 2 generic and a black, it's a 1/2 that can't be the target of spells or abilities from white sources, and you could pay 3 generic to put a rebel on the bottom of its owner's library. Like I mentioned, rebel decks were dominant enough that there were lots of mirror matches, so having the Informer, who could hate on rebels, was pretty sweet. This was true for rebel decks who could recruit it to the battlefield, but it was also good in all the other decks in Standard because rebels were everywhere. It's another rebel that hasn't gained any points though since 2001. At number 6, it's Barbed Batterfist, which is by far the newest card on the list. For 1 generic and a red, it's an equipment with 4 Mirrodin, which means that when it enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 rebel creature token and attach this equipment to it. The equipped creature gets +1/-1, and you can equip it for 1 generic. In other words, this is effectively a 2-mana 3/1 rebel, one with some serious upside, since even once it dies, you can hold on to the useful equipment, and you can of course also move it around even while the token is around. It has seen a bit of play in Pioneer Transmogrify decks, which look to get a creature token in play early and cast Transmogrify on it to put Atraxa into play. The Batterfist is one of the many token generators that those decks can use. Most of its points have come in Pauper though, a format where only commons are legal. There it sees play in red-white aggro decks with a heavy artifact theme. These decks like having a cheap artifact that adds to the board to get Metalcraft going on cards like Galvanic Blast. The deck also uses Glinthawk, which can be really sweet with Batterfist, because if you return it to your hand, you're going to get another Rebel token when you cast it again. The Batterfist is likely to continue to gain points in Pauper, and it's going to keep moving up the list. At number 5, it's Steadfast Guard. For 2 white mana, it's a 2/2 with Vigilance, and yeah, that's it. This was actually a pretty good raid at the time, especially for Masques Block constructed in Standard, so it not only saw play in Rebel decks, but in more generic white aggro decks. Steadfast Guard hasn't gained any points though since 2000. At number 4, it's Aven Riftwatcher. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 2/3 flyer with Vanishing 3, and when it enters or leaves the battlefield, you gain 2 life. Vanishing means it enters with 3 time counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove one of those counters, and when the last one is removed, you sacrifice the Riftwatcher. So the Riftwatcher gives you a reasonably efficient body for 3 turns and gains you 4 life, which is a pretty good deal for 3 mana, and that was especially true in 2007. The Riftwatcher is especially good against aggro decks, as an efficient body and a bunch of life is a huge problem for them. While it had some modest success as a sideboard card in Time Spiral Block constructed, it found the most success in standard Revelark decks. These decks played a bunch of creatures that Revelark could reanimate, and most of them had enter the battlefield triggers to give you serious value, and that of course includes the Riftwatcher. In fact, in that deck, the fact that the Riftwatcher ultimately vanished wasn't all downside, since it just meant you could get it back with Revelark. More recently, it's also seen a bit of play in Pauper Ephemerate decks. Because it gains you life when it enters or leaves the battlefield, that means you'll gain 4 life for each Ephemerate, in addition to resetting the time counters on the Riftwatcher. It's got a shot at gaining more points in Pauper in the future. At number 3, I've included 4 cards, because they have a similar design, were played in the same Rebel decks in Block and Standard, and have almost the same score, so they would have made the video pretty uninteresting if I had split them all up. Ramosian Sky Marshal is the legitimate number 3. It's 3 generic and 2 white for a 3/3 with flying, and you could pay 7 generic and tap it to grab a rebel with mana value 6 or less and put it into play. It tended to be the rebel at the very top of your chain of recruit abilities, and it could also grab the aforementioned Joval Queen if you were using her. For 1 generic and a white, the Lieutenant is a 1/2, and you can pay 4 generic and tap it to recruit a 3 mana value rebel. Defiant Falcon is 1 generic and a white for a 1/1 flyer, and it has the same activated ability as the Lieutenant. Defiant Vanguard is 2 generic and a white for a 2/2 rebel, and you can pay 5 and tap it to recruit a 4 mana value or less rebel. Additionally, if it blocks, all creatures that it blocks get destroyed at the end of combat. These 4 really illustrate what made Rebels so good in Block and Standard. The game plan was to play out Rebels, and then you could move up a chain with those recruit abilities, grabbing larger and larger Rebels along the way. All 3 of them were important to Rebel decks between 2000 and 2001, but haven't really seen play anywhere since then. At number 2, it's Big Game Hunter. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 1/1 that destroys a creature with power 4 or greater when it enters the battlefield. It also has Madness for 1 black, which means that if you discard it, you can cast it by paying its Madness cost. Adding a body to the board and killing an opposing creature is almost always a powerful play, and while paying 3 for this isn't always awesome, paying 1 definitely is, especially against decks with lots of killable targets, and you can even potentially do it at instant speed. Big Game Hunter didn't see any play in formats with smaller card pools like Block, Standard, or Extended, but it's been successful in all of Magic's non-rotating formats. Legacy was the format where it quickly found a home. During the time that Survival of the Fittest was legal in the format, these were toolbox decks that could use Survival to easily search up cards that were good in specific situations, and Big Game Hunter had the added bonus of having Madness, so you could not only search it up with Survival when you wanted it, you could discard it with Survival and pay the discount. And when you did that, you also aren't really going down cards to tutor up a creature, and that's super powerful. Survival of the Fittest got banned in Legacy in late 2010 though, and Big Game Hunter hasn't seen play in the format since then. However, it's found modest success in vintage survival decks, and most recently it's been played in modern, first in toolbox decks that used Birthing Pod, and later in decks that used Chord of Calling. It was also played in Hollow One decks in the format for a while. These decks specialize in discarding tons of cards with Faceless Looting or Burning Inquiry in the extreme early game, so that Hollow One would be free. Big Game Hunter was a card you could discard and still get value out of. The banning of Faithless Looting largely eliminated this deck from Modern, but the Hunter is still seeing play in toolbox decks in the format, and it actually has a pretty legitimate shot at being the #1 Rebel on the list someday. For now though, at number 1 we have two Masques Block Rebels with identical scores, lin-sivvi Defiant Hero and Ramosian Sergeant. These two were played in every Rebel deck in Block and Standard, so they were the most important of them all, even more so than the group of Rebels we saw at number 3. Ramosian Sergeant was the only 1-drop Rebel in Masques Block, so it was the only way to get your curve started. It's 1 mana for a 1/1 Rebel, and you could pay 3 generic and tap it to recruit a 2 mana value or less Rebel. Lin-sivvi Defiant Hero is a legendary Rebel, one that costs 1 generic and 2 white, and you could pay X and tap her to recruit a Rebel with mana value X or less. You can also pay 3 generic to put a Rebel from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Lin-sivvi is definitely the most powerful Rebel of them all. Her recruitability is more flexible than everyone else's, and her ability to put Rebels back in your deck also means that you can get back your Singleton and Toolbox Rebels and then just search them up again. So you can see why both of these Rebels are the only ones that were played in every Rebel deck to top 8 a major event. The Sergeant is the cheapest Rebel, and lin-sivvi is the most powerful. In fact, lin-sivvi was so good that she had to get banned in Masques Block Constructed so that the format wouldn't just be made up entirely of Rebel decks and decks built to counter Rebel decks. These two also saw play in standard Rebel decks throughout 2001, but like the other Masques Rebels on the list, they don't have any points since 2001. This is why Big Game Hunter and perhaps Barbed Batterfist have a really good shot at passing these Rebels in the future. So those are Magic's best Rebels. Do you want to start a rebellion? If you do, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.